the person you're arguing with. Not zero, but very little. Sometimes there's value in other people watching, and that's the thing. Most of these threads, if they're videos or trains that not many people watch, very few people are going to see them. And if they are videos or threads that lots of people do watch, the chance that your thread kind of gains any extra attention is quite low. It's not zero, but it's quite low. And so you have this situation where you're expending all this effort making arguments, attempting to make good arguments, trying to be as erudite and logical and empirical as you can, uh, and uh, oh, it looks like this is working. Okay, my checker is telling me to say something. Can you hear me? Okay, sounds like it's working. Thank you. I'll keep going then. Third time's the charm. All right. So anyway, so I like much better to uh, create a video in those circumstances. I always find myself when I'm typing to think, yeah, I should just make a video about this, and then at least more people will see it, and it will be kind of a better venue to talk about whatever. So, uh, abortion, very interesting topic. One of the problems with discussing it is that it does touch onto so many other important, varied issues: the rights of parents, obligations of children, tort, damages, expectations, um, when is human life, what is human life, personhood, rights, uh, utilitarianism. Like, it's just a very, very complex nexus of issues. And it makes it very hard to discuss it without going onto necessary tangents. It's very hard to answer a question about abortion if you don't, um, you know, at least address what is a human life, what is not a human life, and do the parents have obligations to their children or not? And inevitably, then the discussion gets kind of bogged down in questions like that, um, and that's makes it very difficult. And that happened repeatedly in the comment section there. But sometimes you have to go on those tangents, I feel like, just to try and make sure that your position makes sense. So the first comment on my video on abortion, and again, uh, abortion, very interesting topic for the reasons I listed, probably more than the reasons I listed. I haven't talked about it much. When I started my channel, I did a couple videos way back in 2011. Haven't done any since, or very few since, and it's becoming a hot topic issue between the Supreme Court and a series of these laws passed in other states. So worth debating again. And interestingly, in the interim, this wasn't really true back then, but libertarian arguments, basically pro-choice libertarian arguments and counter pro-life libertarian arguments, have kind of snuck their way into the mainstream debate on the topic, which is kind of a fascinating development in its own right. I think it's a testament to the lack of rigorous principled thinking that's going on within mass political culture. There are actually leftists and rightists who have more nuanced, refined ideas, but very little of that is making it into the discourse on the topics. And so libertarian ideas are kind of sinking in there. But anyway, the first comment: what's the point of even debating this topic if you're an Ancapistan utopian fantasy dreamland? You wouldn't be able to make abortion illegal regardless. Okay, that's a snarky jab, but actually brings up a good point. And my which I feel to be a snarky reply, although it doesn't really address the point, is it would be easier in Ancapistan to enforce any law, regardless of how trivial, than it is for you to influence our legal order with a YouTube comment, and yet that didn't seem to stop you. So, but he brings up a kind of a good point, and maybe not the best way, that is there any way that something like crime, there's people believe that there are certain crimes that would be very difficult, if not impossible, to enforce in a stateless society. And indeed, there are probably this is probably also true just with some certain crimes in a state society. There are certain types of activity that are just very difficult to police in any meaningful way, or attempting to police them would either a make a current state much worse, transform it into some kind of police state. I think all states are police states to one degree or another. But if there's a serious attempt to enforce certain things, um, for instance, let's say there was a law that said that no one is allowed to have sex except on Fridays. Uh, you can imagine the state apparatus necessary to try and enforce that. Uh, that would have to be a much more invasive state than we currently have. Alternatively, when it comes to anarcho-capitalism, a lot of people think, and this is also true with circumcision, interestingly, people will say, well, a stateless society would not be able to prevent crimes like abortion or circumcision. And so, if you think that these are really morally wrong, if there's some moral imperative to protect the fetuses or the newborn baby boys, in whichever case, then aren't you then creating a justification for, if not a need for, a state? And I think that ultimately these arguments really fail to grapple with the mechanisms for a polycentric legal order or a market-based legal order. Um, it is probably true. It's certainly true that in Ancapistan, you're not going to have any kind of institution that is going out of its way to make sure that certain crimes are not committed. In fact, there probably won't be an institution to make sure that any crimes, right? There's not going to be a dedicated company that's entire job is to obliterate murder as much as possible. I don't think that such an institution will exist. And I think it's also a little bit unfair because we have a state now and it hasn't obliterated murder, it hasn't obliterated robbery, it hasn't obliterated rape or any other crime. And it has tremendous resources at its disposal that it's not utilizing towards that end. The obliteration of a crime is not the primary motivation of any states, regardless of what the crime is. They are empowered to be in power. It is a power elite, a special elite, a social class, a political class, and a bureaucratic class uh, that kind of rules over society, and that is their primary interest. And one of their selling points, one of the reasons it's harder, it's very difficult to stay empowered by brute force alone. So they have this basket of goods that they claim that they're giving, many of which they monopolize, and some kind of deterrent against crime is one of the things that they try and sell on. But that's not actually a promise that they will completely obliterate those crimes, and they don't really make any effort to do so, beyond a show of force. So no, and Campistan would be no different. I think you would have to look at it a case of a shift to tort law, right? So I don't think that in a this is David Friedman's kind of point, and I think it's the only fair one. There's kind of a no victim, no crime, and people are going to be charged. Now you say, well, what if the victim is killed? So you're going to murder. Who's the victim then? Well, there'll be any family. If the immediate family is dead, then extended family. If the extended family is dead, the super extended family or some other dependent. Um, the killing of a person, the destruction of a human life, is something that um, is quite a serious crime and entails quite a serious cost. And there would be an incentive for somebody to be the plaintiff. This is why we already have a very litigious society where people are looking for reasons to sue. And if somebody is murdered, uh, the murderer owes quite a large degree of restitution to somebody, and it won't be difficult to find somebody willing to come forward and say, "Hey, I want this restitution." And pretty much the nearest kin would almost always have uh, that uh, be entitled to that, um, whether we're talking about murder or abortion. There's a whole thing where insurance companies would probably not cover it. If they don't want to cover it, doctors would probably not want to do it. There could be, if the society is really against it, I mean, if people really believe that it is murder, you wouldn't even have to have that. Just the ostracism that comes with it, the social stigma that comes with it, this could be quite powerful. Um, I don't want to assume in my scenario, in my Ancapistan scenario, that everybody is going to be an ardent pro-lifer. And this is sort of a contingent thing. If you have a society where everybody's pro-choice, it doesn't matter what the government says or doesn't say. People are going to be pro-choice, and it doesn't matter what's going on in Ancapistan. If everyone believes abortion's okay, then abortion's going to be tolerated. Even if even if David Friedman's somehow able to weasel in some law to stop them otherwise, uh, you know, this is kind of contingent. People will make these arguments. Well, what if everyone believes that abortion's okay? How is Ancapistan going to deal with that? Well, it's not, and neither is a state. If everyone believes abortion is okay, even if you had the people who make up the state thinking it's wrong, their ability to police that would be quite minimal. And it's quite doubtful that they would continue to oppose it if everyone in their state that they're ruling is against it. So it's a good question, but yeah, between ostracism, insurance companies, torts, legal fees, the fact that you would have to bear the cost of the abortion yourself, which is something, right now it's being subsidized to one degree or another. Some people say the amount that it's subsidized is exaggerated. Other people think that it's exaggerated quite heavily. But doctors could be held accountable. They could be sued. This is especially true if one of the parents is not okay with it. Well, one is. Uh, but yeah, any families, grandparents, aunts, uncles, uh, yeah, I think there's a lot that could be done. Now, it would not make abortion never happen. It wouldn't be impossible for it to happen. But there's no system that anyone can promise that will eliminate crime to the level of zero. So, um, yeah. So here I want to go to this comment by Denver Hoggett. I'm going to read this. In my opinion, the question is not whether or not the fetus qualifies as human life, but whether or not the fetus has a right to life. Interesting distinction. And it's pretty clear to me that fetuses don't have a right to life. Certainly people think they think fetuses have a right to life, but I don't believe them. Here's a hypothetical illustration. Here's a hypothetical to illustrate. Suppose I am in a room with Ben Shapiro and another person, and I pick up my phone and tell the person, there's a sniper with his scope lined on your head. I'm going to text him now and tell him to shoot you. Is it permissible for Ben to use violence to stop me from sending the text? Up to and including killing me if necessary? I would say yes. You might even go further and say Ben has an obligation to try and stop me. Regardless, I think Ben would try and stop me if this happened in real life. Now suppose that Ben Shapiro is sitting outside of an abortion clinic. He sees me walk in with my wife while loudly proclaim, we are getting an abortion. Is it then permissible for Ben to kill me? I would say no. But even if you answer yes to this question, would Ben actually use violence against me in such a scenario? I doubt it. But that's puzzling. Ben clearly believes fetuses have a right to life, and in a situation where there is a clear violation of said right, it's easy to imagine him taking action to defend it. But in a similar situation with similar conditions, with the same right supposedly being violated, it's much more difficult to see him take action. That itself is evidence to me that even ardent anti-abortion advocates actually don't think fetuses have a right to life. If they actually thought abortion was murder, I suspect their actions would be very different. That isn't to say abortion is itself justified. There are more nuanced arguments against abortion, e.g., consequentialist arguments that might be strong enough to prevent abortion, even if it isn't murder. But I think it's totally wrong, and I think pro-life side of arguments is closer to our common intuitions. Okay, so I think that there are a couple assumptions in there that are questionable, and then a very, very big logical leap. So the first questionable one is the one of assuming that pro-lifers don't actually mean it; they actually don't consider it murder. Uh, yeah, I'm sure that's true of some pro-life people. There's many millions of pro-life people out there, and I'm sure they all don't have a uniform view on everything in their mind. And of course, everybody out there, among people who make any claim whatsoever, people who say they think murder is wrong, people who think they say rape is wrong, people who say that they think copyright infringement is wrong. Yeah, there's some subset of anyone making that claim that, for whatever reason doesn't believe it, and I'm sure that's true for both pro-life and pro-choice people. Um, but I think that you are wrong to assume nobody would try and stop it. We have cases of people killing abortion doctors and sending bombs to abortion clinics and threatening to kill people. And so I don't know what percentage of the pro-life population that is. It's a pretty small one because the government does not allow that and will persecute anyone who attempts to do that. So they're suppressing that activity to a point. But it is clearly wrong to assume that everyone who's pro-life would never act that way. But you are driving at a real point here, and that is there does seem to be a difference in the way people behave. This was drawn out, this very similar, kind of going to the same point or distinction. I was actually, I think, tweeted at Ben Shapiro at one point, and the scenario there, which I think is more similar than you're giving it credit. We talked about this in the comments below, but let's say a fireman storms into the top floor of a 10-story building. The building's on fire, and there is a zygote in some kind of petri dish. It's alive, it's viable, and there is a 10-year-old child, and he can only save one. And what would he do? And most people agree that he would change. And I think Ben Shapiro was asked this, and he said, well, I would save the child. And most people would say that I would save the child. Well, then that goes, well, doesn't that then logically prove that the fetus doesn't have a right to life, or that it's, no, it doesn't, because there's other logical explanations for that, right? And we don't even need to use abortion as an example. We could say, yes, forget about a petri dish with a fertilized zygote in it. Think he barges in, and there is a 10-year-old child and a 80-year-old terminally ill cancer grandparent. Who does he save? Well, he saves the child, I assume. And does that mean then that the 80-year-old doesn't have a right to life, or that it's okay to kill the 80-year-old whenever you want? No. A distinction is made in a lifeboat scenario between two types of life. We do this all the time. Whenever a ship sinks, right, what's the cliche? Women and children to the boats, men stay behind. It's the same thing with war. It's the same thing when prisoners are taken. Let's kill the men, let's not kill the women and the children. And those actions, they might make sense in certain contexts, but they don't imply that there's no right to life or anything of the sort. Um, so there are reasons that people would fail to intercede that have nothing to do with whether a fetus has a right to life. Currently, they would be prosecuted by the government. So there's lots of people who would say, well, I do think it's murder, but I'm not going to do anything because I will be punished. And so that doesn't make any point. There are other people who believe, yes, it's murder, but they don't think that they have an obligation to intercede. You have this a lot, actually, with concealed carry. There's a lot of people who believe very strongly in self-defense. They think that you have a right, if somebody attacks you, to kill them. I mean, these are people who would say if you came up and splashed a milkshake in your face, they would be justified in pulling a gun on you and gunning you down because you assaulted them, and you don't know if there was acid in that drink. You don't know what's coming next. But those same people very often will say they would do nothing to save the life of another person. A, because they don't think that they're obligated to do so, even though they acknowledge that it's murder. B, because that would incur a liability on themselves. You could go to jail because you saved the life of another person by utilizing your firearm, your weapon. So just because, and again, that's very common among concealed carry holders. And you wouldn't then say, well, concealed carry holders must not believe in murder. They must not think murder is a crime because they only do it to defend themselves. Only a fraction of concealed carriers will use their weapons in the defense of others. In fact, like if you read Boston Tea Party, who is my go-to on the gun rights, and he's very strongly libertarian, would say you shouldn't do it. Like you really shouldn't do it unless it's your best friend or a family member. A lot of people say myself or my family, and that's it. So there's that. So people think I'm not obligated. Even if I think it's murder, I don't want to suffer the negative consequences. I don't think that's the best way to approach it. So there's a big logical leap there. Um, this I think that's evidence to me that even ardent anti-abortion advocates don't think fetuses have a right to life. No, they're saying that they do think it has a right to life, and you're really making a big leap in interpretation of their actions that I don't think is a justified one. So uh, no. Now it does drive at a point, and I think there is an intuition here that, well, okay, sure. a fertilized egg or a zygote or a first trimester fetus is technically a Homo sapien, but isn't there a it's not the same as a person walking around and doing stuff. And I agree, it's not the same. There are definitely differences. But do those distinctions make ethical differences? And in some cases, the answer is yes. In some cases, the answer is no. The problem is that most of the things that you could say about fetus, you could say about other things. Oh, it doesn't think, it can't vote, it can't pay taxes, it doesn't have a job, it's not independent. These are all things that apply not just to fetuses, but to young children, to toddlers. So it's not a particularly strong claim. But the other thing is, rights seem the only kind of coherent idea for rights, and I think this is actually a problem that states have imposed on us. The way that states have addressed this is that uh, rights have to have some kind of contingent on ability, and they don't. It seems very difficult conceptually or in terms of utilitarian grounds to think that rights just all accrue suddenly at one point, right? So it's not like you are a you're a human life, but you're not a person, a legal person that you have no rights whatsoever until you say turn 18. Just to use an extreme example, that you can't vote, can't drive, can't have sex, can't consent to anything, can't deny anything. Your parents can do anything they want to you. Your school can do anything they want to you. The state can do anything it wants to you, and you are completely nothing, and then you have a birthday, and then you're completely enfranchised in every way. And I think people understand that that is ridiculous. And even in our current system, we have gradations. Okay, well, you're not a full person, but you can get a driver's license when you're 16. You can consent to sex when you're 16, depending on the state. You can consent to have a child. You can get legally emancipated. You have rights, right? You can't be killed. You have to be treated a certain way, right? So there's gradations here. And that's actually itself a very interesting topic. And if you've seen my videos on like age of consent, or if you read Teen 2.0, you just see that there's this developmental process that happens with human life that at a certain stage is completely dependent, has no volition of its own, and then it slowly progresses to the point where it can exist on its own, it can take care of itself, it can be formidable even, and it kind of builds rights as it goes. And that is a totally valid discussion to have. However, the first right has to be the right to life. Like none of the other rights make any. It would just be nonsensical to say, well, the fetus has a right to own property and to sign contracts or to vote, but it can be killed at any time for any reason. Um, the very first right is the right to life. Everything else, right, free speech, gun rights, whatever, driving, consenting to sex, none of that. It would be just ridiculous to say, oh well, you can consent to have sex, but you can be put to death because you're not 16 yet. So there's a lot of debate to be had there. But the one point where there isn't debate, the first, if there's this continuum, if there's, where does the continuum start? It starts when you at conception. I don't know any other place to start it. At birth, I mean, there isn't a developmental difference between birth and a day before birth or a few hours before birth, which is a point we'll come to in a bit here. So let me go up to the next. Uh, what is? Oh wow, this is a long comment. I don't know if I can read this all. So skip that one. This might be dumb, but a concern I have about essentially banning abortion is what do the long-term effects look like for society when we are forcing mothers to have unwanted children? Will the numbers be insignificant? How many of those mothers' partners will end up being good role models and raise their kids to be well-functioning members of society? How many will get put up for adoption? Okay, yeah, these are interesting questions, but like once you're born, there's still the question of will your parents be good role models? Because they might not be, right? And that wouldn't mean killing the children is okay. And also forcing a woman, see, I don't know that that's fair. You either got pregnant on purpose or you did something that made that risky. So this would be like saying forcing somebody, this forcing somebody to account for their actions. but it's their actions. So again, the example I keep using, because I think it's a good one that illustrates most of the points effectively. If you accidentally harm somebody while driving a car and it's not their fault but yours, you owe them restitution. You can be reasonably expected to pay for their medical bills until they're better, and uh, you can't just. It would be wrong to couch that and then say, oh my God, you're being forced to help this person. Well, you put them in that bad position, so yeah, it's not necessarily that ethically onerous to force you in that case. Do, do, do. So, I mean, what would happen? We don't know. I think that people would be more careful about contraception. I think people would be much more careful about that. It would still happen sometimes. There would be black market abortions, fewer than we're currently having, but I'm sure that would happen. And you'd probably get a lot more marriages as long as the government wasn't banning marriage. I forget who I was listening to, but in the 40s and 50s, there used to be pretty common for people to get married and then to have children, have their first child 7 months or 6 months into the marriage, strongly implying that the woman got pregnant and then they got married as a result. And you can say what you will that's not the fairy tale wedding that people fantasize about, but it might be a better scenario than killing the baby or just never getting married. Oh my gosh, Ivan the Heathen. Very long comment. Let's see. So, yeah, I don't think the question of when someone becomes a person is the kind of question that science can answer. It's a metaphysical question. I agree. Uh, I have some degree of sympathy with those arguing that say embryo isn't a full person. Sure, I have sympathy with that as well. But if it has any degree of personhood, and I think it does, it's a human life, uh, then it has to. If it has anything, it has the right to life. If it has anything, right? We're worried about the rights of animals. We're worried about not torturing. You know, I mean, this is especially weird with vegans. Oh, you can't kill a cow, but you can kill a fetus. Well, fetus. I mean, cows have a right to life when the fetus. He talks about kind of the Platonic. Where did he put that? Yeah, a huge point in favor of pro-life position. It doesn't require you to split hairs that make arbitrary distinctions. That is a huge problem, just in terms of developing any kind of ethical system. If we just start drawing arbitrary lines, yeah. Let's see. Okay, Shane XYZ. He made a couple comments. I don't agree that a woman having voluntary sex is giving property right to whatever degree to the fetus to occupy the body. The main reason for this is why I think most analogies fail, is because I don't see who she is giving the right or consent to during the sexual act. Unlike inviting somebody into your house or kidnapping them onto your boat, there is no person who you are contracting with or infringing upon with sex who would receive such a right. Are you given permission to some metaphysical would-be fetus? Are you giving permission to some metaphysical would-be fetus? If so, what are the terms of the consent? Can the fetus break such terms? Can a woman bind the would-be fetus to, say, an obligation to pay off her student debt prior to conception? Can we make contracts with other non-existing things? Or is the contract somehow with nature? This case is unique because the act of sex in such cases is creating life. I'm not sure when I'd call a human or separately a person due to my mere ignorance on my part. Not giving some sort of right to it, I know I'm stealing the general idea from Rothbard here. Okay, so the problem with this, it's kind of like assuming that ethics, the start of ethics is contract. And if there isn't a contract, then there's no tort, that there's no obligation, that there's nothing. And I think that's completely wrong. If you harm somebody or you put somebody in a harmed position, and let's be clear, in the anarcho-cap and Ancapistan that we all hope for, it'd be very likely that most people would be members of arbitration organizations or insurance companies, and that for common disputes, say car accidents, and we already have this to a point, or just other types of torts that are typical among people, uh, your insurance company and their insurance company, or if they don't have one or you don't have one, their company and just yourself would come to agreement and make a restitutional exchange, and that this would be kind of standard for the vast majority of 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 disputes. And then there would be cases where one party or both parties are not satisfied, and it actually goes to arbitration, and you get into that. But there certainly are going to arise cases where you commit a tort against somebody who you don't have any previous agreement with, you don't have a contract with, and I don't think you can be like, well, I don't have a contract with you, so I don't owe you shit. No, you if you hurt somebody, you owe them shit, right? You owe them restitution whether or not you have a contract, whether or not um, you surrender a property right to them. You don't have to surrender a property right to somebody. The tort is the claim. The damage that you do to them is the basis of their claim to you. It's not coming out of nothing. I think this is the problem here. It's just kind of assuming that the fetus's claim is based on nothing. The fetus's claim is based on the fact that it has been put into this extremely dangerous and dependent position, put there or created in that position, either way. And there is maybe a distinction to be had there. But again, uh, I think that the best analogies here again are involuntarily capturing somebody. Say you accidentally scoop them up onto your boat. You're out with your friends in the middle of the ocean. You find out that you have scooped up the stowaway on accident, no fault of theirs, and you can't just say, "Listen, I don't have an agreement with you. You don't have any kind of ownership over my boat. You have no property rights in the boat. So you know what? I'm evicting you right now." No, it's not their fault. If it's not their, it's different if it's their fault. If they had done something, if they had snuck on, say they were trying to steal something or whatever. But if it's not their fault and it is indeed your fault, then you owe them. And the intention here doesn't always give you a get out of jail free card. I think that there might be an argument for, let's say somebody has sex and they're very careful. They use contraception. And they take as many steps as possible to avoid a pregnancy, and it still happens, versus maybe they try and have a pregnancy and then they just change their mind halfway down. I think that there is an argument that there might be some difference, some distinction to be made in terms of the obligations there, but it's not zero. The fact that you take precautions to prevent harming others doesn't exonerate you from, if you in the less likely but still possible chance, harm somebody. I can wear my seatbelt and follow the traffic laws and not speed and not be drunk and not do anything like systematically wrong and still hit somebody and be at fault. That can happen. That does happen every day. And you can take the precautions to try and not get pregnant and still get pregnant. It just goes with the territory. And it's not just for the woman, it's for the man too. You could conceive a child. And in so doing, you have created a human life. This human life is very vulnerable, at least initially, and for, a trimester or two at least. This is something that technology will slowly change, but at this point, you put them in this really bad position. It's not their fault. They were conceived after the act, so by definition, they're innocent. And because by virtue of you having put them in this bad position, that's a tort against them. They have a tort against you. So it's not. I just think that this is kind of a red herring. Um, we went into that for a while, but that is. Do you think that having a miscarriage or falling over is manslaughter, though? Or if a mother is alcoholic and causes a miscarriage, would that be murder? I'm starting to think breeding in general is immoral. Uh, Breeding in general is not immoral, but it does come with this big responsibility. And this is something that I think some of the classic libertarian writers were getting wrong. Um, you know, I mean, they would get it right. Be like, yes, if you're a big private company and you make big profits by taking risks, that's fine. And they also understood if you take big risks and you lose and you go bankrupt, that's also fine. And so, almost every libertarian would be against, say, bailouts for a corporation. AIG or Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac or whatever getting a bailout, yeah, Rothbard or whoever would say that's totally wrong. But then if you get pregnant because you just go and have a good time, you go out with your buddy, your friends, and you get plastered and you have sex. Then they're kind of like saying you should be able to bail out then too, and I don't think that's right. Um, you have incurred a great responsibility. Um, is there a distinction? Sure. I don't think that. I mean, miscarriage. There's different types of miscarriages. So there's miscarriages that really there's nothing you could or could not do. They just happen. I know women who tried very hard to have children and they did everything as best they could and they still miscarried. And I don't see how that could be a crime. Uh, on the other hand, they could just be, I mean, putting the, they could really be skirting the line of attempting to get an abortion. Say that, I don't know, they're going to a Muay Thai class and getting kneed in the stomach or punched in the stomach, punched in the face, pushed downstairs, and like, oh no, I had an abortion. Yeah. So I think that there is an argument to be how negligent here. Um, if somebody is constantly getting drunk or again engaging in risky behavior and they happen, I think that they're probably more guilty than those who do nothing wrong. Those who do nothing wrong did nothing wrong. And it's a little bit different. You're driving a car. Look, at the end of the day, the car has the potential energy to kill somebody. You step on the gas, it's just there. So, you don't get in the car if you can't risk it, right? If you can't afford to take that risk, then you don't do it. Uh, Once you have a fetus growing in your womb, in your tummy, uh, you're responsible for that. There's some miscarriages that there's nothing you can do, and so I would not charge them. You could say negligent homicide, maybe, for people who are being reckless. But I think there's a there's a lot of nuance that could be had there, but I don't think that it's a death knell to the question. And I don't know. I mean, very few pro-life people are talking about charging women with miscarriages. It's more about charging the doctors who do it and just not letting it be covered by medical procedures. But uh, so Shane XYZ made an earlier comment on doing these out of sequence, but I think a woman's domain over her body is not constrained by any implied or explicit contract with the fetus, meaning she has the right to remove the fetus at any stage, save any contract with anyone, e.g., the father. There's a concept I'm fond of regarding using the least amount of force necessary, which is why I initially attracted to evictionism. But I honestly think that in such a case, if we're comparing it to trespass, for example, this literally just equates to giving the fetus a reasonable amount of time to leave, which I think is being seconds or minutes at most. This is obviously isn't realistic to assume the fetus would disappear upon command. So I see abortion at any stage as being justified. So late-term abortion is justified. Okay. I do think that viewing abortion as just a form of trespass or just a form of property occupation is an error. Libertarians like to think that everything can be solved by one or two general principles. I don't think that's the case. There is, I think, a real notion of needing to come up with fully unique rules regarding abortion that scares some libertarians. I argue that generally agreed upon property rights are most coherent with pro-choice stances. Practically any pro-life law or enforcement will end up just feeding the Leviathan. Yeah, but like laws that feed the Leviathan don't necessarily feed the Leviathan if there isn't a Leviathan. This goes back to the earlier point. I don't think there's anything particular about abortion or circumcision or murder or burglary that is that states are the most optimal means to enforcing them. So that is a whole side topic about legal enforcement in a non-state order, but um, states don't police these that well now. They weren't stopping abortions that much before. Um, as long as you have a state, it will use anything to grow. So that's true. But if it's going to do anything, it should stop murder. It should stop homicide. So um, again, you have domain over your body, you have domain over your property, but people can have a legitimate claim against you, right? You don't have to sign a contract. There doesn't have to be the implied contract. Oh, you go into a restaurant, there's an implied that you have to tip, blah, blah, blah. Uh, like that's all true. But that doesn't mean that you like can never incur any kind of obligations. If you harm somebody, you can definitely do that. If you owe somebody restitution, you can definitely do that. And if you place somebody in a dependent position, and here an example, I used, uh, and we'll get to this in a second, but if there's a much bigger topic than I have time to get into right now about obligations to third parties. Do you have any? And the libertarian kind of critique, and I think it's the argument that I agree with, is that you don't have any involuntary positive obligations to other people. If other people say they need something or actually do need something, and it's not your fault, you didn't do anything to put them in that position, then I would say that you don't owe those people. So starving girl shows up at your front door says she's starving. I think you have the right. I mean, she can ask, and you have the right to slam the door in her face. Then there's people who don't agree with that, who think that her need is some kind of obligation onto you. I I feel like there is a certain amount of intuition that goes into that, but I think that that's wrong because there's just no logical limit to that. You could just, and then the people who advocate that, oh, you should be forced to provide a starving child, that just immediately leads to a Leviathan that can do anything in the name of that, even if 99% of what it does is not even ostensibly about helping the extreme needy. Um, but the situation totally changes if you are the result, if you are the cause of their starvation. So if the child is starving because you destroyed the crop she stored for the winter, which we could imagine a hypothetical scenario where that happens. Um, yeah, that's Jim Jesus right there. Um, yeah, like if you're responsible, then you owe restitution, right? So this isn't the case of some random third party. The fetus is not some random third party that you have no connection with. I think that that is really disingenuous to characterize what's going on in that way. Uh, uh, the fetus is there because both parents, the mother and the father, or one parent, the father in the case of rape, decided to either explicitly create the fetus or take an action that risked the fetus creation, have sex, right? So maybe they didn't intend to have a child, but they had fun, and in the course of having fun, they risked creating this entity that's going to be completely dependent on them. And I guess there could be an argument for people who don't know that, or if you have two adults who are capable of having children, who do not understand that that's possible, that's a possibility. I think that they actually have one of the strongest claims. I think one of the strongest pro-abortion scenarios is the case where the parents have no clue that that was a possibility. Like they just did not know that that could happen. And that's hypothetically possible. That's extremely rare. So how many cases that would apply to, I think, is negligible. But if they know that's a possibility, and I think 99.999% of couples do know that, then they'll take measures, and even if they try and do be as careful as possible, if it happens, it happens. And you can't just say, well, I didn't mean for this to happen. I can't say I didn't mean to hit you with my car, so I'm not on the hook. That's not how that works, right? If you harm somebody or you put somebody in a dependent position through no fault of their own, you're the one who's on the hook. And so I just don't think that, like, oh well, we didn't sign a contract before stipulating that I would owe. It doesn't matter. Your actions are what put them there, so you are responsible. So this is a good quote from Hooksinker. If you accidentally hit somebody with your car and they go on life support, I recognize you're the party at fault who bears responsibility. But is there not some standard by which, above a certain level, restitution is no longer reasonable, commensurate? Do I have to keep them on life support for decades, even if, say, most doctors agree that they are in permanent vegetative state because that's what the family wants? Is 18 years of child support or going through a full pregnancy, or did you not reasonably commensurate with whatever negligence is associated with having sexual intercourse? I don't think that it is. Yeah, this is actually a pretty interesting and good point. So, uh, you know, I think that there is an argument, as I said earlier, for uh, differential punishments based on where you're doing your best, your level best. You know, you're driving your car, you're following the speed limit, you're being safe, you're not texting, you're doing everything that you can, and you still have an accident. I think you're still responsible, but you could make the argument that it's it's mitigated by your caution and your responsibility. Your attempt to do the right thing is it mitigates potentially, um, what you're on the hook for relative to if you were just being fight, if you're drunk, if you're just being reckless and dangerous. And so I think there's something to be said for that. Um, but that doesn't mean that you can just completely get off the hook. And if you're going to be on the hook at all, and I think that no matter how safe you were, you are on the hook for some of the damages. In the case of abortion, that minimally means life, right? There's no other. That's as minimal as you can go. We could argue about keeping, paying for their college. We can argue about being their parents. I think it's very easy to just, not easy, but when alternatives here say, look, I don't want to take responsibility for this. Uh, okay, I can't kill the fetus. I can't kill this human life that I put in this bad position, but I did not want to be a parent. And I tried my best to put myself in a situation where this wouldn't happen. Well, you can transfer that. Other people can take on your debts. Other people can take on your responsibilities. That's a big part. We already have that today. If you harm somebody with your car, for instance, and you have auto insurance, they're going to take up a big part of the cost potentially. That's the whole point of having the insurance. And indeed, now that I'm just saying that, in Ancapistan, you would probably have that. You would probably have insurance for unwanted pregnancies. Wow, I'm a genius. I've never heard this before. If anyone's ever heard this before, put it in there. But yeah, that seems like the obvious thing. But one of the things that you could do, you can do this now, is you could put it up for the adoption, and you could say, okay, I'll see the fetus through to viability or birth, one or the other. And technology is allowing viability to be earlier and earlier. And then I will find somebody else who will take on the responsibility for parenting, and I will surrender that. I will, and eh, there's, depending on the child, right? If it's not messed up too much, there's plenty of people who are going to be willing to do that, especially if the state's not regulating it so bad to make it difficult. But yes, I definitely think that um, child rearing insurance, and there's all kinds of ways that could work out, but um, yeah, I think that there are ways to get out of some of your obligation, but if you're going to have any at all, it would be to not kill your victim, to not kill the person you put in this bad position. There's a common thing too, where people like to say, "Look, you destroy the little girl's crops, but those were her crops. You destroyed a property that she had. She had built this. The fetus hasn't built anything. The fetus you created. So since you created it, it has nothing except for what you gave it, and so what you gave, you can take away." And I think that the big problem here is this is the pater familiaris, because the Romans believe this. But this, again, is not something like so many other arguments for abortion, is not limited to fetuses. This would mean that you can kill your children too. I made you. And you get this a lot. Like fathers, cliche, tell their sons, even their sons piss them off, like, I gave you life, I can take it away. Um, if that's a principle, then human life is totally subordinate to the authority of the parents, the filial piety, and it does not extend to just abortion. It extends to all childhood and basically to all life, right? Even as an adult, you could be a 40-year-old man, and your parents are still your parents. They still gave birth. They still created you, and so the logic here seems to be that there is this indefinite obligation from the child to the parent, and that the parent has an unlimited scope of freedom of action when it comes to their children. I don't think anyone believes that. You can't you can't start cutting your kids up. You can't do that. There's all kinds of stuff that not only is it not legal now, but most people would agree shouldn't be legal. And one of the areas, where there's a contention here that I get into a lot is circumcision. But it's very weird to be like, yeah, you can't do that, but you can kill them if they're not in the fetus, and if before they're born. And that's like, why is when they're born so important? They're still your progeny after they're born. You still created them after they're born. When they're born, it's not like they have a farm that they have, mixed with their labor and created um, a property right in. It's not like when they're born they sign a contract with anybody. It's not like when they're born they start paying taxes or whatever, they're still at that point nothing, in that sense. They're still the minimum a human life. And again, if there's going to be any rights at all, it's the right to life. And anything else is going to be derivative of that. And so that's the first to come and it's the last to go. That's that simple. I shouldn't say it's that simple because it's not simple, but for the person, I was expecting you to be sympathetic to eviction arguments, but I agree with your arguments against it. So I was never big into evictionism, but I will say when I was in college, I was pro-choice, and I just took all these people who are pro-life, they're hypocrites because they don't adopt, and they should adopt, and they'll only adopt if it's a perfect white baby, and if it's a black baby, they won't do it, and blah, blah, blah. And like, even if all that is true, it's not a justification for abortion. Abortion is a human life. End of story. It's homicide. You need a good reason to commit a homicide. And there are good reasons to commit homicides. Self-defense, suicide maybe. There are cases where it works, but just none of them for abortion. Uh, Yeah, so here's one. I don't know what the answer is, but hoping technology around contraception and fetus viability will make it go away. Like so much else in free market capitalism, it won't completely solve the problem, but it will alleviate the problem in ever further increments. So, especially if there's no out for abortion, this is already true, but this would be more true in a free market economy where there's no regulations and where aborting a fetus is not considered okay. Contraception technology would be better, and people would be incentivized to be more careful in its use. That doesn't mean there wouldn't be mistakes, but then that's fine. I have no problem with that. And then technology for viability of the fetus would also increase. If we're in the situation where people can't kill a fetus, but they don't want to be obligated forever, there is an incentive suddenly, especially if your insurance companies are paying for it, to say, hey, is there a way once we reach viability to remove the fetus from the mother and get it on track to somebody who actually wants it and wants to fulfill the rule? So good. And I got to hurry here because I have jujitsu in a little bit. But yeah, so Paratastes, I'm saying that wrong. He made a good video, follow up to mine. If you want to find his comment, he put a link into it. Um, I don't see in the comment here, but yeah, he makes the point. It's kind of like a Zeno's paradox for abortion, where it's like, okay, so it's fine before birth, but 10 seconds before birth, it's okay to kill, but not after. And there's just kind of this continuum of, people talk about viability. So when it's not viable, it's okay to abort it, but after it's viable, it's not. But what about 10 seconds before it's viable? What about an hour before it's viable? What about a day before it's viable? It just starts to raise a whole host of arbitrary ethical questions that belie easy answers. Somebody references Smedley Butler, totally unrelated. Uh, let's see. And then Thomas Jackson, I think a dimension that is often ignored is the parental duties that come with children. I agree, and I made a video right after this called Parent-Child Obligations because I think that's a huge part of this. It's one of those intersectional tangential areas that people need to look at. So, um, yeah, again, this is a very difficult issue to talk about without going into all these tangents and looking at all these other uh, ways of looking at it. But it is an interesting topic. I will say it's kind of interesting. Not everyone agreed. Obviously, there's plenty of pro-choice libertarians, but the tenor of the discussion is not identitarian and it's not flagrant feminists or anything like that. So nobody's calling someone baby killer or hands out of my pussy or anything like that. It's a much more antiseptic kind of discussion, which is good. The debate that's happening in popular culture is devoid of almost any content, which is, I guess, amusing, but also terrifying. So this may not be the last time I talk about it, but go ahead, if you see this video, feel free to leave any comments, and I think it's a nice format to kind of go over them in a video of their own, because then more people will see the discussion. It's a little bit more involved. So if you haven't seen, not many people watched it, but before this video was uploaded, I did a giant parent obligation video because I think that deserves its own committed video. And there may be others to that. Very few people commented on that. I think probably I fell into a YouTube hole there. But if you want to check it out, it's very related to all this. And I think that's it for now because I really got to go to class. But all right, I'll talk to you all another day. Bye bye.